Welcome to Binge Watchers, where we talk about the stories and characters we love and the shows they live in. My name is Ron, and let's talk about Season 1 of The Alienist. In the 19th century, people with mental illnesses were considered to be alienated from their true nature. Experts in this field were therefore called alienists. And this show, based on the book of the same name, tells the story of one such alienist and his quest to catch a serial killer who preys mostly on children and murders them in gruesome ways. On the surface, this is pretty much another detective show. There's a crime, there's a super smart person who's a bit of a weirdo, who's able to see stuff that other people can't, and he tries to catch the killer. It sounds familiar because it is. It is most TV shows. And there are a lot of aspects of The Alienists that do feel familiar, but not to the point where it hurts the story, but more on that in a little bit. The angle here is that this is the 1890s. Forensic science exists, but barely. There's this joke by John Mulaney where he says that back then, as long as the criminal was not at the scene of the crime when the cops got there, they're pretty much clear.
Detective, we found a pool of the killer's blood in that hallway. He would just be like, gross. Mop it up. Now then, back to my hunch.
In The Alienist, we see Dr. Chrysler and his team use the very early foundations of forensic science and profiling to catch this killer. And this is where this show actually kind of reminded me of Mindhunter, where they also try to figure out crimes not by analyzing evidence, but by trying to understand how the killer thinks and why he does the things he does, and not necessarily how. So a lot of this show is not so much about the tension and suspense of will they catch this criminal, but it's more about how they evolve this process, the objections that they get from society, and how it affects the members of the team personally. The team that forms around Dr. Chrysler and his investigation was probably the most interesting part of the show for me, especially because every single performance in this show is fantastic. Luke Evans specifically shines in this show, and Dakota Fanning and Daniel Bruhl are also incredibly strong performers. It does take a little while to get used to Dr. Chrysler, which very much serves the character because he also seems like the kind of guy who would be an acquired taste as a friend, whereas John Moore, Luke Evans' character, is a guy that just people like. So I don't know if they were going for it, but Daniel Bruhl does this thing with his voice, and it takes some getting used to, and I felt it reflected the personality of the character very well. So as Dr. Chrysler and Sarah Howard and John Moore and future President Theodore Roosevelt form this unlikely team to go after this child murderer, in the process they make a lot of powerful people angry, they make a lot of enemies, and they're forced to look more deeply into themselves. Much of the drama in this show doesn't come from the investigation itself, but it comes from the relationships between Chrysler, Sarah, and John and the other people affected by the investigation. This is a masterfully produced show. Everything about it looks amazing. Obviously, I can't really gauge the historical accuracy of how New York City looked like in the late 19th century, but the show makes the city feel real and lived in. It doesn't feel or look like a set. And the atmosphere and vibe of the show is so carefully constructed by the cinematography and the music. It was just a pleasure to watch. Try to watch this one on a bigger screen and not on your laptop. Like, that'll work too. It's definitely a slow burn. The show takes its time with pretty much everything. Nothing moves fast. But I didn't feel that this show had any pacing issues. It's just not a fast-paced show. And I think that it's very much a character over plot kind of show. The story here is super familiar, and it doesn't really offer any twists on the formula. It's a detective story, and it has everything that you would expect to find in a detective story. If you are experiencing a case of detective story fatigue, this show is really not gonna make that better, but what it does offer is some great characters and really great side stories. Sarah Howard, for example, is a fascinating character. The first woman to ever work for the NYPD, raised by her father to survive as a woman in a man's world. She has to fight for her place pretty much every second that she's alive. And she is brought to life beautifully by Dakota Fanning, a balancing act between her desire to prove herself and to pursue justice and to stand her ground, and being a woman in a time where they weren't even allowed to vote. John Moore, played by Luke Evans, was probably my favorite character in the show, a man who's led a rich and spoiled life, who's more sensitive than what society deems appropriate for a man, and he discovers his values in the face of the horrible things that he has to see and deal with during this investigation. I found these characters deep and intense, and they were way more interesting than the investigative story I've seen 1,000 times. A very good story that I'm sure I'll watch 1,000 times more, just a very familiar one. I also absolutely loved the side story about Roosevelt fighting corruption as the commissioner of the NYPD, which is a real story that of course I read all about right after I was done watching this show, and I love when a show makes me do that. So the main story in The Alienist, a solid detective story, was really more of a background for me to get to the characters and their stories, which I thoroughly enjoyed. So, bottom line, should you watch it? Yes, I think you should. I think that between the amazing look and feel of the show and the profound characters and the solid, though familiar story, this show is definitely worth a watch. And to the credit of the detective story in this show, which I know it sounds like I didn't like, it's a very clever story and I did like it. I just don't think that it's the main appeal of the show. And you might not feel that way if you haven't watched a ton of police shows lately, but they do seem hard to avoid. A lot of shows seem to be police shows or some variation of a detective show. So let me know, have you watched this show? Have you read the book? What were your thoughts about it? And also, what's your favorite non-detective story show? Now all that's left to do is to wait until the end of the year and see if this show will claim a spot in the glorious, prestigious Binge Watchers Awards. If you're going to be talking about spoilers, please use spoiler tags in your comments, and I'd like to thank the patrons supporting this channel on Patreon. I really do appreciate it. I want to plan our first TV Show Club Hangout thing, so if you're on the $5 tier, please check out the post that I made on Patreon a few days ago for more details on that. You can find all the links to our socials and our Discord server, which is of course free for everybody, in the description down below. And if you're finding Binge Watchers for the first time, welcome. I'd like to invite you to join the Binge Watchers community. Come talk about TV with us. It's a lot of fun. Subscribe to the channel. But in any case, keep binging, and I will see you on the streets of 19th century New York City.